The Peter Lynn Apprenticeship. Now that there are loads of people kitesurfing, the technique seems obvious. You stand on a planing surface, be it a surfboard, water skis or foilboard, power up the kite, lean back, steer to the side and off you go. But back in the 1990s, I had an idea for a different approach. Rather than lean back, why not lean forward? Start with a foil that attaches to your feet, but rather than it pointing in the opposite direction to your legs, as foils do on a surfboard or wakeboard, have the foil pointing forwards, in the same direction as your toes. It would look something like this, with a strop to the kite line anchored here. You would dig the toe end into the water, and the kite would raise your body out of the water, and you use the foil board to head off in this direction or that way. I discussed this idea with Peter Lynn, and he suggested, why don't you come over to New Zealand and give it a try? So I saved up my holiday. I took 3 weeks from 1 year's holiday allowance and 3 weeks from the following year's holiday allowance and booked a 6-week trip to the other side of the world, stopping off in the USA for a while on the outward leg. The journey from California to New Zealand did not go according to plan. The aircraft ahead of ours had been an island hopper, stopping off at 4 or 5 tropical islands as it made its way across the Pacific. But it had broken down and left passengers stranded all over the place, so my flight was rerouted. Rather than the direct flight as scheduled, we stopped at several tiny tropical islands, the sort of place where the arrival of a jumbo attracts the attention of everyone on the island. At each tropical paradise, they stopped the plane, turfed us out for an hour, and then brought us back on board. We didn't see much of the islands, but I did learn an important life lesson. As we emerged from the cabin door, we walked into a solid wall of heat and humidity. I couldn't wait to be back on board. Life lesson learned. These places are certainly beautiful, but the heat and humidity is not for me. Eventually, I arrived exhausted in New Zealand to be greeted by Peter Lynn himself. Those of you that know Peter will be familiar with how untidy and scruffy he appears to be on the kite field. I had got the impression that this was as a direct result of living on the road and expected him to be a little bit more presentable at home, where he had the benefit of the ever-patient Elwyn taking care of his laundry. But no, he's even scruffier at home. Peter's memory is highly selective. He disavowed all knowledge of my plan when I arrived, and despite the huge cost that I had invested in the project in getting to New Zealand, he became furious with me when I cut up a metre of stainless steel tube to start to build the frame for the structure of the device. And so the gadget was never built. However, one evening he was sketching in his notebook and looked up and said, "I have an idea for a boat. It's a bit odd because it is wider than it is long. Do you want to build it?" Whilst the description seemed ridiculous, the width was because it had outriggers on both sides, and we agreed to get started in the morning. We were both members of AYRS, the Amateur Yacht Research Society. Sailing has a long history and is divided into communities for each different type of boat, and there is an inclination for people to stay within their own cliques and refuse to be associated with people outside. This was brought home to me when I got a kite boat. In Berkshire and Oxfordshire there are many lakes, mostly man-made as the result of gravel extraction. There are clubs there for all sorts of different watercraft, but when I went to find somewhere to sail my kite boat, I found that because I didn't fit into any of the established classes of vessel, I wasn't welcome in any of them. But AYRS is different. This is the group for people who tinker with funny boats. They welcome kite sailors with open arms, but unfortunately they don't have a lake. Your typical AYRS member will have an idea and spend a decade or so building a prototype to try it out, whilst also attending many meetings and writing papers about their ideas. But Peter doesn't fit that mould. His techniques are rough and ready, but he works hard, builds boats, tests things, then rips them apart to try something new. So there was a lot of pre-existing stuff that went into this boat. We'll start from those outriggers. They were basically the floats from a trimaran kite buggy boat of the type that I owned an example of myself. The hulls had enough displacement to do the job at low speed, but at higher speed they were designed to come up on top of the water and plane. The main flotation came from two similar hulls to the outriggers, which were also pre-existing, but these ones were about twice as wide, providing extra buoyancy. The main hulls sat fore and aft, and the front one was designed to be able to swivel and act like a rudder. Yes, this boat steered from the front like a car, not using a rudder at the rear, as is normal in a boat. To join the fore and aft hulls, Peter had some aluminium tube, maybe 6 inches in diameter, and joined at an elbow. It wasn't strong enough to do the job, so we laid it up with a few layers of fiberglass. Then we tensioned the arrangement with a kingpin and tensioning wire. Like everything else in the project, this component was designed to deliver the strength required when loaded at the maximum speed anticipated. In Peter's workshop there's a faded sign on one of the roof beams which says, "If it doesn't break, it's too heavy." And this is a motto that he designs by. As we worked on the boat, we mused about the corollary to this, which is that since you design every component to take the maximum stress and strain and no more, it follows that should you accidentally exceed the design load, then you should expect every single component to fail simultaneously. Peter reports that this is indeed true to life, because when one component fails, it is likely to cause the immediate overload of an adjacent component, and you will find yourself in a heap of wreckage as the whole boat self-destructs around you. For the mast, Peter had one from a previous project that he dug out of the long grass. It was bent, so we cut out the kink and bolted it back together again. The long grass contained a number of treasures, old projects that had been broken or dismantled, and which served as a rich ore of parts and components to be reused in new projects. Partway through the build, I did cause Peter to despair when I suggested that we short-circuit the whole process and simply put the boat into the long grass without bothering to sail her. For the outriggers, we decided to build a space frame. Peter had a stock of windsurf masts that he had managed to acquire on the cheap on the condition that he never used them in a windsurfer. We placed 2 masts side by side, maybe 50 centimetres apart, and used short sections to make triangles between them, all laid up with fiberglass. When it was dry, we tested it and found that the stiffness was excellent in one direction, but far too floppy in the direction at 90 degrees, where there was no triangulation to improve the stiffness. So we added a third windsurf mast and triangulated all round. Because we needed to get the boat to Lake Clearwater, 70 kilometres away, we made sockets to accept the space frame in the main beam, so that the boat would not be wider than the road during transport. Peter had a sail that he wanted to use for the boat. It was designed for a racing catamaran called a Tornado, but he said the sail wasn't right for this design. So he cut a metre off the bottom to make it shorter. He then added a sliver to the side, maybe 25 centimetres at the bottom, tapering to nothing at the top. This wasn't just a sewing job. This was a fully battened sail that was being rebuilt. While Peter scratch-built the rigging, I made trampolines to allow the sailor to walk out to the outriggers. I learned a lot about getting things done, which has served me good through the rest of my life. We had no written plan besides a sketch and some calculations. We solved problems as we came across them, and we just got the job done. Elapsed time from sketch at the far side to putting the boat on the water. 1 week. Nice. Despite the accelerated build time, it is still likely that Peter would spend more time building the boat than sailing it. It was a bit fragile, so it was never entrusted to my novice handling. Instead, I learned to sail by jumping on a planing catamaran that I could get up to speed, then push further and get up onto one hull before overcooking it and capsizing. Righting it again was right at the edge of my ability, but with determination I could manage it and dash off again in search of another accident. A few weeks after getting home from New Zealand, I phoned back and asked how the boat was getting on. Peter replied that he had put hydrofoils on it to get it right up out of the water. I asked if it was successful. Well, yes and no. He explained that while the hydrofoils work, the boat was basically unsailable. When the boat was in displacement mode, it was heavy, low in the water and cumbersome. 90 degrees of rudder was insufficient to get the thing to steer properly. The displacement drag was too much, and the thing just didn't want to get up onto the foils. But if through some miracle of luck and judgment the right wind came at the right time and you managed to get it up out of the water, it let free like a thing possessed, and suddenly half a degree too much rudder in the wrong direction would be enough to get it to turn turtle and capsize. And thus, whilst it held promise, it was another frustrating failure. No doubt by now the various parts have been consigned to the long grass and reused in new projects, but the attitude and the genuine conviction of "I can do this" has stayed with me lifelong.